this tour so far, I thought I'd jot down a few notes about what's been happening from my perspective. Is that I used to be the speechwriter for George W. Bush. So what comes out here might be a little bit garbled.
You wouldn't have done much work there.
And so to chronicle what's happened, and we've already had a couple of recitations of it, it's appropriate to sort of set the backdrop. You have to get a few things sorted. Most importantly, cyclists, in my opinion, are either camels or goats. It has to do with a power-to-weight ratio, sort of like marriage. Camels are large, ponderous characters who like the flat. Goats love mountains and generally borderline anorexic. Sometimes, although it's not recommended, camels and goats get together, and their offspring is a genetically modified goat, or also called a hybrid. Of course, there are variations. Some camels look like wombats, Chris, for example, from Adelaide here, and some goats look like emus, sort of like Terry over here. I am definitely a two-humped camel, as would, for example, be Jeff Whiting. He would also be a two or possibly a three-humped camel, depending on your opinion. Anyhow, when such a diverse population manifests nesting behaviour, the outcome is very interesting. According to David Attenborough, they will nest randomly, often leading to bitter territorial disputes, mostly over the intensity of nocturnal noise. Some female goats complain that their neighbourhood is dominated by surround sound flatulence, while the odd male camel speaks enviously of the basso profondo of the woofers coming from his neighbour's shelter. The woofers are fundamentalists who believe their own nocturnal misdeeds are silent and benign. Then again, just flicking my paper here. Then again, it is in the establishment of the nest that some of the more fascinating and ritualised behaviour can be observed. One nesting couple were observed rotating their tent 27 times before setting on an appropriate aspect. Another couple saw the female fall asleep leaning against a tree as her mate perfected the angle of the tent peg. And this particular observation was to do with a South African fellow, very nice fellow, very exacting with his tent peg. Anyhow, unfortunately, some camels, especially the snoring variety, could only cycle into the wind. Oh, wait a minute, I've got a paragraph here which I've missed out on. Excuse me. Now it happened, and so this is the chronicling now, that on the longest day, a wee bit of wind and rain sprang up. This was welcomed by those sailors who knew that they could tack, and were thankful for their angular heads and bodies. Unfortunately, some camels, especially the snoring variety, could only cycle into the wind with their mouths open, and subsequently filled up with air and cycled the rest of the distance like balloons. The goats found the hurricane wind difficult. Some were found blown off course and ended up in the middle of some field, but were happy to chew on some weeds. The grates on the roads added variety to the road, and one or two camels were rudely woken from their fixation on the rear end of a goat. Also, it was amazing how many sets of false teeth were scattered around these grates, and it became quite a hazard, prompting the organisers to erect signs, "Beware, teeth on road." The tour organisers thought of everything. We were provided with weather girls who were expert at forecasting the weather in the Solomon Islands. The travelling toilet was another fabulous innovation. The problem was that having a poo at 90 feet was so awe-inspiring, and a number of the camels didn't sign out for 2 days. They were presumed lost in the river. Which brings us to the flash floods of the Flinders, which is a rock group. The organisers thought to brighten things up a wee bit on day 4, noticing that the hurricane and hail had no effect, by creating a mountain bike diversion across 400 raging torrents. Some goats found it challenging to cycle submerged to the top of their helmets, lacking the requisite lung capacity. The camels loved it, their humps proving useful for buoyancy. Some rejoiced afterwards that their saddlebags were full of barramundi. Unfortunately, several goats were discovered floating downstream days later, still proudly pedalling, connected to their bikes. These goats weren't noticed from the sign in sign out sheet because some camels got cross-eyed, ticking the wrong column. Being cross-eyed only made them more attractive to female goats. And the nightly traffic traipsing between tents intensified. Or it could have been camels with weak prostates. Anyway, the noise reached fever pitch. Volunteers were exceptional. They had to be. The organisers thought it best to wake everybody before they had actually gone to bed. This meant that the goats were still asleep and some of the goats were still asleep, were rolled up in the luggage. It's just as well that baggage handler first class Thomas, hello Thomas, was careful in scanning the baggage for terrorist bombs and detected a faint heartbeat. It was reported by the poor goat who was rolled out of his bags that he hadn't slept in 5 days. And no, he wasn't a terrorist. The organisers thought it important to procure a resident stargazer who, from accounts, was itching to point his telescope. However, what with their cloud cover, his frustration erupted in an uncharacteristic bout of forgetfulness, and he persuaded the hybrid goat Steve from Peakhurst to swap his towel for some mutual navel gazing with the stargazer's wife, which, surprisingly, she rejected. Anyway, look, I've got a bit more rubbish here, but I better let you get on with it because, one afterthought on all this. Geez, I've got a sore leg. Those of you who voted in the elections for a goat actually got a camel. And by combining the camel with a hybrid, intent on goat-to-goat marriage, and replacing all cars with bikes. So it's actually a very good outcome for our cyclists. When it